Mr. Chair. Madam Premier, thank you for being here. Thanks to your DMs and staff for being here. I also just want to take a moment to just thank you for the work you do. I know it's a thankless task at times, sometimes worse than thankless, and I certainly don't always agree with every position you take, but I do just want you to know that I appreciate your service to Albertans and to your team as well. So, having said that, I have some questions about your business plan in particular, and on page 75 of the Executive Council business plan, the second last paragraph says the British Columbia government's decision to back down on its threat to what can flow through federally regulated pipeline in response to Alberta government action is a small victory in the larger effort to see TMX through to completion. Do you feel maybe you were a bit premature in taking a victory lap on Kinder Morgan, given recent events?
Well, as I've said already, we made it clear that we would pull the wine ban if they pulled 0.5 and pulled the ability to assert what otherwise what we would argue completely illegal and unconstitutional tools. And that is what they did. At the end of the day, though, it's obvious that the sort of cat and mouse game that they were playing with sort of throwing up potential other unknown legal challenges got too much for Kinder Morgan. And that's why we've said it has to stop. And that is why we are pushing very, very hard. And I, as I said, will not stop doing it until we get it built.
So when did you first know? I mean, did this come as a complete surprise to you when Kinder Morgan pulled the project? I mean, had they been in touch with you ahead of time? I mean, did you receive the news at the same time everyone else did, or had you been in touch with them?
We knew a little bit before, but not much, just by a matter of day or two.
Yeah, and one of my critiques has been the negotiating in public, so I certainly want to ask you to do that. But I'm just curious if there's conversations you had with them were of a financial nature previous to the public announcement on their part?
You know what? That is where we're going to get. We're not going to be negotiating in public. We had started having conversations with them on a number of different fronts, and then their board in Texas took a look at the matter, as you know, and came to some decisions. And then for the purposes of meeting their legal obligations and reporting in the markets and all that kind of stuff, they went ahead when they did.
Okay. So on the consequences of the British Columbia government's intransigence on this have been Bill 12, and as I said in the House earlier today, it is unfortunate that it's come to this, but here we are. I would like to hear from you, though, that one of the concerns I have with this is, and I know that industry is broadly supportive of the approach that you've taken on this, and I am also broadly supportive of taking this action. And again, it's very unfortunate that we have gotten to this place. One of the concerns I have is just how broad the bill is, and I recognize we're going to have an opportunity to debate it in the House, and I certainly look forward to doing that. But one of the things I would encourage, and I will in fact be bringing an amendment to this end, is a sunset clause in the bill. Because I think one of the concerns that I certainly have, and I imagine industry does as well, is these are broad and sweeping powers that should be used in a response to a very specific set of circumstances. This is not the sort of power that a government ought to have in perpetuity. Would you be willing to entertain building in some form of sunset clause into this bill?
Sorry to cut you off, yeah. Mr. Clark. I was just wondering, within the estimates and business plan, what are we tying into? I'm just trying to follow along.
Sure. I would come back to the key responsibility of coordinating and implementing government's mandate and priorities, as well as very specific references to the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline within the business plan as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, you know, when we're looking at legislation such as this, which again has such broad and sweeping powers, is that something that you would envision government having in perpetuity, or would you entertain a sunset clause on this bill?
Well, you know, I think it's an interesting question. It's certainly one that we turned our mind to at different times because of the broad level of authority that it gives. But it also needs to be understood in terms of the overall stated purposes of the bill, which are to maximize potential return for Albertans. That being said, understanding that there are a number of different factors which contribute to our ability to maximize the potential return, there may well be some value to bringing it, having the matter reviewed on an annual basis or biannual basis or something like that, as to whether that's still required given the nature of the industry. So, but it needs to be done on a broad-based level that looks at all the factors that contribute to our ability to maximize our returns.
Okay. Thank you very much. One of the questions that has come up from my discussions with those in industry is should this bill be required to be used, whether you would consider some form of compensation for economic loss?
Well, again, what we have indicated to industry, and again, not negotiating in public or any of those kinds of things, is that we would be, we've committed that they will not be taken by surprise, and that we will work very closely with the effect with industry as a whole, and that should it get to a point where a specific part of industry would be affected, we would be working very, very closely with them and engage in very active consultation with them at that time.
Okay. I understand that Alberta and British Columbia have some co-located international offices and consular missions, and the path I want to go down here is in your capacity as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs as well. Have you considered the potential knock-on effect of this dispute on other aspects of the Alberta-BC relationship in terms of co-location of consular offices in that specific example?
I will say that we have not really turned our mind to the co-location of consular offices. That, of course, is, again, a matter that the Minister of EDT would be more seized with. Generally speaking, of course, I mean, our task force, we have a task force. We also have an internal group that is very seized with market access, and we look at a range of things, hence the wine issue, which, many people were concerned was not directly related to oil and gas. But so we've done a fairly wide-ranging assessment of shared interests. Okay.
So, and to that end, again, in your capacity as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, I have the inventory here, the 2016-17 inventory of international and intergovernmental agreements. It is riveting reading the dozen or so
sure
pages of it. But I did spend some time here counting up the ones that are primarily or exclusively Alberta-BC relationships. So I'll ask first if you're concerned that, really a similar question, are you concerned that this dispute will have an impact on any of these agreements? Are there any specific agreements that we have with British Columbia that you're more concerned about than others in terms of tainting the relationship?
I think generally speaking, we, and again, without sort of showing our hand to BC, who I'm sure somebody in BC has been tasked with having somebody watch this conversation, we know that our province is highly integrated with BC. In some regards, when you see today, for instance, business leaders from BC talking about how a bump in the price of oil or price of gasoline in BC would negatively affect Albertans, even though we know it would do that to a much lesser extent, it actually enhances the argument that our government has been making for 18 to 24 months at least now, which is that when the price of oil drops so precipitously in Alberta, we probably saw somewhere between up to 40,000 British Columbians lose the ability to pay their taxes in BC because of the integrated nature of the two economies. And so there are a multiplicity of ways in which the economies are linked, which is why this sort of siloed approach to analyzing this pipeline coming into the Lower Mainland and through the port of Vancouver has been so frustrating. frustrating to so many Albertans, because there's not an Albertan that you can run into who doesn't, with great frustration, talk about, yeah, but my this and that in BC, and I do this and I do that, and why don't they get that they need our gas and our oil and our business and our investment, and there is a high level of frustration. So in answer to your question, we're aware that there are multiple areas that are in jeopardy, but we also think that they were already in jeopardy by virtue of the position of the BC government on the pipeline. And so we need to break that intransigence in order to open the floodgates of renewed reciprocal win-win situations between our two provinces.
Right. So I'm going to go a little off script from what I was going to ask next, but what I'm really curious about is you've got me thinking about this sense that we can't believe we find ourselves in this position. You know, how is it that we've had 150 years and 6 months of Confederation, and yet here we are? How is this possible? So maybe I'll ask a general question. If you, Minister of Economic Development or Innovation, comes up with a time machine, Alberta Innovates comes up with a time machine, and you could go back a couple of years and do something different, what would you do differently, knowing what you know right now about this particular situation?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, the bottom line is that there has been a lot of polarization around environmental issues and pipelines because of a longer-term failure to understand that progress on environmental sustainability, on environmental standards, on environmental health, it's not an either-or situation with jobs and economic growth, and that in fact the two must be put together if we're going to succeed. And that's what our government has strived to do ever since we've been elected, to redefine the debate and redefine the narrative so that it's not an either-or thing, but it's that one must go with the other thing. And I think that the polarization which had developed in the past was not helpful. And so we are dealing with the leftovers of that. I will say, though, that I have found that in our conversations with a number of people in BC, and yes, the Premier of BC is not one of them, but there are a lot of other folks in BC who otherwise would characterize themselves as progressive, moderate, environmentalists who are growing more and more supportive of where we are going. And you see that today, you know, the poll that was released in BC today, you see that the sort of practical support for this pipeline is growing because, of course, the evidence and the facts combined with the work that the industry in Alberta has done so steadfastly over the course of the last 2 years to meet and exceed the standards of many people concerned about environmental sustainability, is winning the day with the moderate majority. And so I think we just have to keep doing it. It's just that, you know, we have to build some bridges over some chasms that have developed in the past.
So before your next question, Mr. Clark, I want to commend you on your creativity for the time machine, but we do have to stay focused on the business plans and the budget at hand here.
There is no time machine yet. Yes. You don't know, I'm already in the future. All right. So I will come back and get back on task to what I was going to ask. So, you know, we talked about whether you felt there was any risk in those 7 trade agreements or intergovernmental agreements. I guess I'd flip that around and ask perhaps the other side of the question and say, have you looked at those agreements or any other areas for opportunities for other areas of potential leverage against British Columbia? We've obviously done the wine ban, and that arguably had some effect. It certainly captured the attention of both Albertans and British Columbians. It's something that I can tell you I'm passionate about. Right. It tends to hit you at home. But there's some things here that perhaps even have a more material effect on British Columbia, which potentially offer an opportunity to apply some pressure to ensure that they actually adhere to the Constitution, the rule of law, and don't do further damage to Alberta and Canada's reputation as a place to invest. Have you given some thought to where else we may be able to apply some leverage?
We have absolutely done so. We have quite a long list of other things that we are looking at. We, of course, have the Market Access Task Force that has been at work. I mean, actually, they started working last summer. And then we added additional members, external to government in after the stuff that we saw out of BC in January. And but we have been looking at that, and we have quite a long list, and we'll sort of deploy them strategically as things go. I mean, as I've said in the past, what we really want to do is try to find the right balance between getting everybody's attention, and in some cases not just getting BC's attention, but Ottawa's too, and at the same time doing it in a way that secures the least amount of negative blowback to Albertans in terms of their security and prosperity and all those kinds of things. So it's there are definitely lots of things that we could do, but we'll hurt this industry, but we'll hurt ours more. And so those formulations end up being things that we try to stay away from. That being said, there are a few others, but again, I'm not going to put them in the window today necessarily. Okay,
fair enough. Thank you. I'm going to go back and change tack here and go back to the business plan, some of the performance measures that we had talked about previous. I do find it quite remarkable that performance measure 1A, that there would be 21% of ministries would report to Executive Council that they're unhappy. But I recognize that's one that you're moving on from. On 1B, I just did some really quick back-of-the-napkin arithmetic, and if 7,425 visits over the 7 months of October 16 to March 17, that's roughly 1,060 visits a month. But if we take the 10,000 visit target in 18-19, that's only 833 visits a month of this website. You're talking about the internal tools and supports available to them and make use of these tools, and understand that's a measure of traffic to a website, internal website that you've set up. So I guess I just wanted to ask if you've, these measures are always kind of an interesting thing as to whether they're all that meaningful, but I just wanted to flag that and see if you had any thoughts on whether these, if you could explain why it is that on a monthly basis it looks like the actual use of those tools would be going down based on these measures.
Well, I think probably the best answer to that, having not dug in fully into how we came up with those numbers, is probably that, it's a new measure, so we're going to track it, and we will see how we're dealing with it, and what the numbers are on a monthly basis over the year. Of course, we anticipate it will fluctuate over the year. It will go up at certain times. It'll peak like crazy in February, for instance, and then other places it will go down. So, but I think what we're going to do is we're going to measure it, track it, and then at that point we can certainly look at whether our targets need to be improved. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah.
So again, just coming back to one of the key responsibilities being coordinating and implementing government's mandate and priorities. One of the things that I've observed in the now almost 3 years that I've been on this side of the table as it relates to government is the silos. So you've got a department whose job it is to do the work of that department, and you've got another department, they do their job. But very often there's touch points. I think of mental health in schools, for example. And I've seen many examples where it's sort of this, well, that's their thing and this is our thing. Is there any effort to change the culture of government to move from a focus on the needs of the institution of government to the needs of the individuals that government is serving? And focusing on those of us on both the legislative and executive side, managing all that complexity and ensuring that people get the outcomes they need. They don't really need to know where it comes from, which department funds it, or how it happens. Is that something that you have placed an emphasis on, and if not, would you? Yeah.
So what does that say? You need to deal with your handwriting, my friend. It's terrible. Anyway, so every initiative has crossed. Yeah. So anyway, my understanding is that part of the performance measures that deputy ministers are asked to adhere to is that the work that they do involves an evaluation of how what their work does impacts the needs, the outcomes, and the objectives of other ministries. And so they are asked to do that in every case, and they themselves are measured against the degree to which they can move away from that siloed approach. I know that the deputies meet very regularly.
Hesitate to interrupt.